Just a quick thank you to all of you for attending tonight and for joining in this conversation. And of course, we extend our thanks to the Aspen Ideas Festival. PBS is incredibly excited to be a broadcast home for this film when it comes to us next year during the height of the political season. And of course, we would want to recognize the incredible work of Morgan Neville and Robert Gordon in making this film. I am going to do some quick introductions for our guests. You've seen them, but I'd love to tell you more about them. We're going to start the conversation up here, and then, of course, I'm very hopeful that that the film provoked a lot of thought and a lot of questions for you out there. So we'll bring you into this conversation as well. So here on the end, we have Sam Tanenhaus. He's a celebrated author, biographer, historian, and journalist. He's edited for the New York Times and Vanity Fair, and from 2004 to 2013, he was the editor of the New York Times Book Review. He's the author of several books focusing on high-profile Americans and American politics, and his latest project is a biography on William F. Buckley. And then we're also joined by Matt Tyrnauer, who's a director and a producer. His film, Valentino, The Last Emperor, profiled the legendary fashion designer Valentino Garavani, and it was shortlisted for an Oscar for Best Documentary Feature. Matt is also an award-winning journalist. He's held several positions at Vanity Fair, where he's currently a contributing editor. And it was while working as a special correspondent at Vanity Fair that Matt first met Gore Vidal and went on to edit him. I'm going to now take the liberty of introducing myself. I'm Marie Nelson. I'm the Vice President of News and Independent Film at PBS. And I will admit that I am also a beneficiary of the great ratings from the Vidal-Buckley debates, because I began my career in broadcast television at ABC News and worked under some of the greats, including Ted Koppel and Sam Donaldson and Peter Jennings. So
it was fun to see Sam Donaldson.
It was. Wasn't it fun to see Sam? He looked like such a baby. So I'm actually going to take a moderator's prerogative and start just from my own curiosity with Matt. You run in some very interesting circles. I am fascinated about the trajectory between working and knowing figures like Gore Vidal, and then doing the film that you did on Valentino. At first blush, you'd think, doesn't seem to be a through line, but when you take a closer look, to me, it seems like there really is. You see the creative genius. They're both captivating and in some ways polarizing figures. They were both in, very long-term same-sex partnerships. Vidal's relationship was for more than 50 years. And of course, there's the Italy connection.
Rome, yeah.
So I just wanted you to tell us a little bit more about what in some ways drew you to these men, and what their lives, what did we learn from them?
Well, I asked, both are Roman, really. Gore lived in Rome for 40 years, and Valentino lived in Rome even longer. And when I went to Rome to make that movie, I asked Valentino if he knew Gore Vidal, and he said, he seems like the meanest man in the world to me. And I asked Gore if he knew Valentino, and he said, I avoided him in Rome for 50 years. So they had no, you're right, I never thought about this, though. They are sort of similar in that they had this they had same-sex relationships in Rome in the 1960s, and they lived, and this is relevant to the film, I guess, they lived by an old code where Valentino really didn't come out until my movie. When the movie came out, the Italian newspapers had headlines, "Valentino is gay." It's an interesting way of approaching sexuality that, in light of the events of last week, seems like absolutely another universe to us. it was something that was lived in the public, and it was sort of like an open secret, I guess you'd say, for both of these men. I'll focus on Vidal now. Vidal was this famous libertine, but he had a partner, Howard Austin, and they lived together. It was a 46-year relationship, which ended upon Austin's death. And Gore was the first to write a novel with a homosexual theme in the English language, which was The City and the Pillar in 1948. So this is an act of enormous bravery. The context of those times is almost unimaginable today. So this was actually why Vidal was very interesting to me, and in a certain way why Valentino was very interesting to me, because and this is so relevant because of last week's Supreme Court decision. It's just, we can't imagine what it was like to live a gay life in the sort of twilight that these guys had to live in those days. And I think what distinguishes Vidal and what he might be remembered for ultimately, although he certainly is not right now, was that extraordinary bravery for writing The City and the Pillar and speaking out in a 1961 documentary, which is excerpted in this movie. It was a CBS Reports called The Homosexuals that Mike Wallace was the correspondent on. And that's where Vidal on screen says that the difference between homosexual and heterosexual is the difference between blue eyes and brown eyes. This is 1961 on network television, which was a really...
That's pre-Ellen DeGeneres coming out on television.
Considerably.
By a few decades.
Considerably, but it was only 7 years prior to being called a queer on another network, ABC, by Buckley. So there is a very interesting... This is part of the through line of the Vidal story, really. And I think one of the questions is, well, what do we make of that, actually, now, today? He was really devastated to be called queer by Buckley on national television. You can see it in his face. And I think it's very important to try to put ourselves back in the head of that time. It's very different than being called out for being gay on TV now, which wouldn't happen. This was a really frightening thing, I think, for him. And I think a lot of the critique of Vidal that you see today coming from a new generation of gay activists is that, oh, well, he was hedging, he didn't want to stand up and declare that he was gay, but he was really taking a different line. He was taking a line of talking about sexuality openly and couching it in historical terms and saying that it was normal, which was a really, really advanced position for his time. So I give him full credit for that. And I think that the Buckley moment is a really significant moment. I don't think it speaks well for Bill Buckley, but I think that it was a real moment, actually, and kind of a covert moment in the history of gay politics in this country, to be honest with you, because this went into, there were only 3 networks then. It identified Gore as not only a public intellectual, but a gay public intellectual, and it really defined him for the second half of his career. And I think that was a really important thing because he was one of the few gay public intellectuals that we had. So
Absolutely.
I think he helped frame the debate that culminated in a certain part last week with that historic decision.
So Sam, I do want to bring you in a minute, but I do quickly want to ask a follow-up question because...
Are you serious? I mean, I've sat here, I think, for how long now, and I would like to be able to at least say something, right?
Oh my God, Sam, are you mirroring the 68 debates?
No, actually, the notice we got was that this was going to be a conversation about public discourse and where it is now, how this might have influenced it. At least that's what I was told in the note I got that the conversation would be about. Is it not actually about that?
That's absolutely what this conversation is about, and I think there are a lot of different aspects to the public discourse, and there's a clear connection between the issues that were being explored in 68 and the things that are happening now. And so I would love to bring you into this conversation, and the question that I had for you, and that I have for you, is for us to talk a little bit about the idea that was thrown out at the end of the film, which is that in television, there is this notion that there's this conflict of interest between things that are highly viewable and that are highly illuminating. And so I want you to tell me a little bit more about what you think in terms of where the road has led us from the 68 debates.
Well, I don't think it began in the 1968 debates. First of all, you have to see 1968 in context. And seeing this film for the second time, I don't know what Matt made of, but I was impressed by how much context there was. The first time I saw it, it seemed it was only about the television confrontation, and you didn't get a larger sense of what was going on in the culture. And this time I thought it did better with that. You're reminded, here as we approach what could be another divisive election, there were riots in the cities where both national conventions were held. There were 2 assassinations. I mentioned Robert Kennedy, but of course Martin Luther King was also assassinated. They were assassinated in the period just a few months. And Robert Kennedy had spoken very eloquently in Martin Luther King's assassination afterward, calming upset citizens in Indianapolis. And so that particular election was one in which the divisions in the culture in the country, and I think film brings this out, were extremely intense. And when we look at our politics today, it feels very angry in a similar way. I think particularly in the Obama years with the rise of the Tea Party, which also had a kind of unmediated anger of a sort that was also happening in 1968. What strikes me at being so different about that moment from this one is here you have 2 men, Buckley and Vidal, who were enormously literate, enormously accomplished, almost too articulate for their own good, I think. And yet there was this idea that they would illuminate politics in some way, that you could put them on television and there'd be genuine interest. I'm not sure now that you could take comparable figures to them, people who have the same position in the culture, and put them on television this way and have them go back and forth as much as they did and attract the same kind of audience. And I think that's one of the questions that was kicking around back then, right? They seem, even the television executives don't quite understand why the audience is so interested in this thing. And that's what struck me as I saw it this time. And I have an idea about that, but I'd like to hear what Matt has to say about it first.
I have this aunt who lives in Pittsburgh who loved Buckley. But she's a Democrat, and she's sort of a liberal Democrat. She always thought he was just fun to watch. And when she told me that, she didn't care about Gore Vidal, really, but she was more politically aligned with Gore Vidal. I just think that they worked on a mass level because they were these marvelous caricatures that could have been on Broadway. They were sort of like characters that you would see on a show like What's My Line, where you would have Arlene Francis and Bennett Cerf speaking with those same accents. And it was sort of like this, mid-Atlantic intellectual burlesque, actually. So I think it worked on that level, a very broad level. And then I think actually the substance of their arguments almost was incidental for ABC.
I think that's a really good point. I was thinking about this before, that, to speak well is not always to speak so wisely. And both of them say smart things and clever things, and they both get some things right. Buckley sees that there's going to be a real resistance to what feels like a kind of anti-American impulse in the country. He's right. Nixon won the election, and the Republicans won 5 out of 6. He got that right. What Vidal gets right is that this hugely overexpanded empire is not going to work, and that's what collapsed under the Republican presidencies we had. So they both got pieces of it, and I think what you've said, Matt, that really struck me too, is a kind of self-parody in what they do. It's very campy in a lot of ways. There's a lot of sly winking that goes back and forth. I don't think that it was simply a matter of Buckley shocking Gore Vidal. I think Gore Vidal was provoking him all along. And he went into the debate, and I think this program shows it pretty clearly, the film does, wanting to get under Buckley's skin, and he did. He'd done it very, very early. What isn't shown from the clip in Jack Parr, where there's a little discussion of 1962 appearance that Vidal had made in the Jack Parr show, was he was accusing Buckley at that point of anti-Semitism and said he'd grown up in an anti-Semitic family. When one of Buckley's great prideful accomplishments at National Review was to expel the anti-Semites from the conservative movement. He would not allow them in his magazine. It was Buckley who read the John Birch Society out of the conservative movement. So he saw himself as really the tribune of an intellectually respectable conservatism. So when he found himself being circled in this way, kind of come at from this angle he wasn't expecting, and Gore Vidal was really good at it. He did it with Bill Buckley, with Norman Mailer as well. Murray Kempton was supposed to write a piece once, and Kempton was a great friend of Buckley's, Kempton the great journalist, about how Gore Vidal had a genius for pushing the buttons of these guys because he saw their weaknesses, which is something a novelist, great writer should be able to do. And I think Vidal really was a great writer.
So what do you think that Vidal and Buckley would make of the rise of 24-hour news, of Fox News, of MSNBC?
Well, I can tell you what Bill Buckley said about Bill O'Reilly, which is he said, I don't like him, he's a bully, which is funny because the early Bill Buckley was seen that way. Firing Line initiated all of this, and yet it was two guys, or two people, there were women, Mary McCarthy was one of his favorite guests, and they would go back and forth, he would listen. It was young people, I don't know if many young people, or probably aren't many in the audience, but when younger people watch them on YouTube, they're bored to tears because it's all so slow and the language is so ornate and the questions are involved and the answers. If you see Buckley and Noam Chomsky as a classic, or Buckley and James Baldwin debating in England, it's all so hyper-literate and sophisticated, it almost seems like a kind of old-style theater to them, and it doesn't work at all. So I'm sure in reverse, they would look at the television of this moment and say, it's gotten even worse than it was back then.
I mean, the time has passed. This might have initiated, this is the thesis of the film, this might have initiated and brought us into our present argumentative time on TV, but in that particular period, there were venues for these guys that were really extraordinary, and it pains me to see that they're not there anymore. Dick Cavett, David Susskind, Johnny Carson even had Vidal and Buckley on, Vidal quite frequently. And now we're kind of down to Charlie Rose, which is good. It's a good forum, but it's on PBS, it's the last. Dick Cavett lives. I mean, he can't get on TV. And Vidal really was factored out of television.
When did that happen?
I think it happened in the early 90s. And Peter Jennings, I heard from Peter Jennings directly, and Gore always quoted Peter Jennings saying that Jennings was trying to get Vidal on ABC during the conventions as kind of like a heritage nod to the past, and the executives wouldn't allow it.
And what was the complaint then?
Probably that he was too ornate and fuddy-duddy, and no one really cared about this guy anymore. I don't know.
So they thought he just wouldn't attract audiences anymore?
Probably, yeah.
Well, you know, one thing that point the documentary makes clear, it's a really good one too, is they were the intellectuals, I forget who says it, is Frank Rich or somebody, that did not condescend to television, who were very comfortable on it, and they understood that they could be exaggerated versions of themselves. They were not afraid to do that. And that's another of this odd parallel between the two. And Matt and I were talking about this. Younger people sometimes, if they close their eyes, can't tell which one of them is speaking. It's that accent, it's the backgrounds. Other similarities between the two, by the way, and here is where Gore Vidal was much more consistent than Bill Buckley. They both idolized Charles Lindbergh when they were young, and defended him till the very end. Vidal said till the end in the various memoirs, he never understood why Charles Lindbergh was not viewed as a great American, because of the anti-war, the America First movement. Buckley was raised in a pro-Lindbergh family, And when he was 15, his father sent a chauffeur to Millbrook, the school he went to in Westchester County, so he could go to Madison Square Garden and hear Lindbergh make what turned out to be the last of his anti-war speeches before Pearl Harbor. And Buckley also, in his writing, revered Lindbergh. They both had this. And it was a certain idea of America, the isolationist idea, an anti-imperial idea. And the big change that came in Buckley's conservatism, the conservatism he led, the movement he led, was that with the advent of communism, they became much more aggressively interventionist, strongly anti-communist. Whereas Gore Vidal stayed very true to that original idea, which is America shouldn't get involved in other people's wars, you shouldn't build an empire, empires are destructive, all the things he says very wisely here. Other things they had in common were going to prep school at about the same moment. They were both born in 1925, as Robert Kennedy also was, and which was an unusual time to come of age, meant they were teenagers right around the time the war was starting. Anybody here remember the novel A Separate Peace? Did anybody read that, read it in school? Well, the hero in that novel was someone that, Phineas, who dies, who had been a very close friend of both Vidal and Robert Kennedy. And they were going to prep school at the same moment that Buckley was going to prep school in New York. They were doing it in New England. And the paradox is that Bill, who became outwardly quite homophobic, actually went to a prep school where close relationships among the boys, there were obviously all single-sex private schools, were encouraged. And Vidal in Palimpsest talks about sort of the anger, and Vidal's a character, by the way, in A Separate Peace. He's the cynical literary guy who appears near the end. He talks about the repression that was forced on them. So Buckley paradoxically came through a much more generous prep school experience and became, as we saw, quite virulently anti-gay. And Vidal, who came out of the more repressed background, is the one who became, as Matt says, a great courageous spokesperson for gays in America. And he's absolutely right. You cannot overrate the importance of the city and the pillar. I'd just make one slight amendment to what Matt said. An important novel published in 1948, the time of the Alger Hiss Whittaker Chambers case, when homosexuality was floating around, and also the year of A Streetcar Named Desire, which Tennessee Williams' greatest play, which has suppressed gay themes in it. I would not say The City and the Pillar was the first novel that had gay themes. It was the first that overtly expressed them. All of Proust is gay themes. All of Oscar Wilde is gay themes. We know, but Vidal's courage was to present it in the most direct, unadorned way. He used the socialist realism prose of the 1930s. So it reads almost like a proletarian novel, the kind of thing Vidal always mocked. This very flat, declarative, unatmospheric prose with no verbal flourishes to write in a very direct way about homosexuality. And I think part of the embarrassment Buckley felt was he kind of knew all of that. He once said, I've heard 1% instead of 4 or 5, that it's actually 1% of Americans, men are gay. He said, if so, I know every one of them. Yeah. And that was, I think, and Gore was right. He pulled that out of him, that thing was in that.
Why do you think Buckley was homophobic? Why do you think he became that way?
I think he was homophobic for the same reason Gore was ultimately a kind of social snob. I think each one saw himself in the other. That Gore Vidal's fear was that, although he talked a great deal about democracy, he imagined himself as belonging to a master class. Buckley's fear was that while he was the great defender of all American values, that he was, in fact, attracted to less respectable ones. And that's what I think they're seeing.
By less respectable, what do you mean?
Well, the ones that would not be accepted in his world, the gay world.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I don't know how we're doing on time, but I can open this up a little bit and say that Vidal, and this doesn't come across in the film really that much, but Vidal thought that Buckley was at least a repressed homosexual.
Oh yeah, he accused. That's what he got
Without a
sued
doubt.
for. But he had no evidence of it, of course. Well,
Well, he was
repressed
trying. He
homosexuality.
was. The thing is about the lawsuit. He was trying desperately to find evidence, and that's really the rosebud of the animus, I think, between the animosity between them.
Yeah, I
One
think
of the things that I found compelling was just to see the evolution in both of their thinking on different issues over the years, and I think that gets us back to this place of thinking about how we expand the room for public discourse in a world where I think that there's a growing resistance to it only existing within the media, or realizing that there are limitations on what the media can do as far as promoting public discourse. So can you talk to us a little bit about the evolution in their thinking and where you would imagine we could create more of a public square to expand the debate?
Well, I mean, the evolution in Vidal's thinking was interesting. I mean, he was very consistent, but he had the great opportunity to have the Bush II administration with these misadventures of empire. And at that particular time in his career and in the medium of television, he was shut out. So he was reduced to pamphleteering, and The Nation published in book form a collection of essays, a few of which I edited but were not published in Vanity Fair for whatever reason. So his platform was diminishing. He wrote 3 or 4 best-selling books that were published in paperback because that was the form he had then. So that, I think, is sort of ironic and sad, but also beautiful that he kept going. And the books became big bestsellers, actually, and they did penetrate to a wide and somewhat of a new audience. In terms of the public square, I mean, it's in our pockets. It's our cell phones. I mean, the medium's entirely transforming right now. There was an article in the Financial Times today that Google and Facebook have made huge alliances with news organizations because the branded news will not exist, they're betting, and that we're all read our news on our cell phones, and everything's very fragmented.
Well, and people are getting, I think especially younger people, I taught students the semester in New York, this past semester, spring semester, every single one of them is getting news through Facebook. Not through, it wasn't even, the digital versions of newspapers. That's how they're getting it. I worked at the Times for a number of years, and I left about 6 months ago, and to finish this book. And the paper at one point, I think they published a big report in 2014 that spent a great deal of money revamping the homepage, only to discover that not even home pages are really read anymore. It's not how people get the news. Part of the complication with guys like Gore Vidal and Bill Buckley is they were so much people of the sentence and the paragraph and the shaped phrase. And I can tell you, because I tweet a little bit, that's really hard to do in 140 characters. And they thought that way, they spoke that way. If you listen closely just to the syntax they use in forming their sentences, it is not only not possible to see or hear on television, you don't hear anybody speak like that anymore. And it's because there was a kind of fluidity between what they wrote and what they spoke. They both wrote many, many books. Buckley's columns alone would fill something like 25 full volumes. And that was something he did with one hand when he wasn't writing novels or wasn't writing his sailing books or all the rest. Vidal, you saw how many novels he wrote. Some of them really fine books that nobody's reading now. Just the patience, the seriousness that requires, the assumption that the audience is ready for this. In a way, they both seem almost naively hopeful about just the quality of discourse in the country. It never occurs to either one of them, quite apart from the unpleasant words they use, that they're words that are too difficult or ideas and language too difficult for their audience. And I just don't think we can imagine that now. And I'd add one other thing. Just look at our candidates now. Look in particular at the Republican Party. And what do we have? We have 14 of them now. And whatever you think of the outcome of the 1968 election, the major candidates were Nixon, Reagan, Nelson Rockefeller, Charles Percy, and George Romney. Each one of them was a substantial figure in American public life. We're lucky if we can find two of them in an entire party now. And so it's a decline that works in two ways. It's not just what the intellectuals say. The intellectuals will always sound like intellectuals. You can read the New York Review of Books, and listen, to my mind, the greatest intellectual in America is at this conference here, Gary Wills, and who wrote the best book about the 1968 election, and was going to write a biography of Bill Buckley. It's called Nixon Agonisti. Some of you may know it. It's a masterpiece of American political writing. Norman Mailer wrote a great book about the 1968 election called Miami and the Siege of Chicago. All this stuff was everywhere. The intellectuals will still do some of that, but what made the books great, and what made this great in its odd way, is the intersection, the interpenetration of the life of mind, the life of ideas, and the very public things that are happening now.
That's
and
exactly right.
That's your job,
That's
right?
my job. My job is to get the rest of these folks into the conversation, and so we'd love to take your questions. And I believe that we have someone with a microphone who will hand them to you if you just raise your hand.
Have we got it there?
Do we have any questions out there from the audience? This must be an Aspen Ideas first.
We've bored them into silence. Can I say one thing about Bill Buckley and Gore Vidal that may surprise people? Is I spent a lot of time with Buckley over the course of some 10 or 15 years. I saw him a lot. I never heard him say a disparaging thing about Vidal. And I never heard him call him anything but Gore. And at one point...
Did you think that spoke to his character, or was that a lesson that he learned after this experience?
I think that was what he customarily did. I think it's how he was raised. And I think that's why he was so chagrined and embarrassed that he did this thing, which was, to just do a really kind of gutter name calling. However provoked he was, he still did it. He was telling me once about someone who had attacked him, and he was telling me this over the phone, and I said, someone on the right, actually, who'd criticized him, and I said, well, how do you react to that? Do you think it's funny? Are you amused by it? Do you shrug it off? And he said, well, I don't like it, he said, because I don't think it's honest. He said, for instance, I would never say Gore Vidal is a bad writer. So there was a certain sort of lines that he tried to stay, or lanes he tried to stay inside. This was the one time he didn't, and it haunted him. So for me, the news in the film, which the first time I saw it was hearing Matt say that Vidal was really preoccupied with the debates, because I never heard Buckley talk about them except for that one moment when he was shocked that Ted Koppel played it on the program. Yeah. I never heard him discuss it other than that.
Well, he was a great mimic, and Buckley was part of his repertoire. He loved to talk about it. It was became part of his big personality and his public persona, really. So he played on it.
One of the things that was striking to me was just how, when you went back and you read some of the transcripts from the various debates that they were both involved in, just how prescient some of their words were. I went back and took a look at, I guess it was a Cambridge Union debate that Buckley may have done with James Baldwin.
A very famous debate.
Absolutely. And Baldwin essentially said in that debate, unless we can establish some kind of dialogue between the people who enjoy the American dream and the others who've not achieved it, we're going to be in terrible, terrible trouble. And then it's like, when you look at everything that's been happening in Baltimore and around the country over the course of the last year or more, you think to yourself, how do we foster that debate? I mean, social media and technology is one thing in terms of how we're exchanging information, and maybe something, some level of dialogue, but it doesn't really seem to get at that idea of really bringing people closer together.
Well, something Vidal said really stuck with me, because Michael Kinsley once said a similar thing to me about the internet. Gore says, well, people are watching television, but you're not sure they're really listening to what anybody says. They don't know what your argument is. They get a fleeting impression of you. And you know this from television. I've done some media, and Matt's behind the camera, but you've been in front of it too. You're coached when you go on television to be provocative, to be aggressive, to interview, to interrupt people. The producer will tell the host, let this guy talk because there's energy, and people who are flipping through the channels maybe will stop a little longer, this kind of thing. Mike Kinsley once said to me, Michael Kinsley, the great journalist, I said, well, does the internet, is it good for democracy? And he said, well, it creates more mouths, but it doesn't create more ears. And I think that's really true, is we all have platforms for talking at each other. And the classic case are the cable things we see now, where they shout and they shout. And now it's just talking to their own constituents, too.
Matt, I'll give you the chance to have the last word before we wrap.
I think we've said enough, quite frankly.
We're all talked out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to the both of you.
Thank you.